Could you take us back to the beginning when you first started working and collaborating with Mark and some of the development of the ideas that led you to Listening Post?
Sure. Mark and I started working in 1999. We got a grant from the Brooklyn Academy of Music and Lucent, which was the owner of Bell Laboratories at that time. Mark was a scientist, research scientist at Bell Laboratories in the statistics and data mining department. Now he's at UCLA. But I had an interest at that point, and still do, in using sound as a way to explore kind of abstract or numerical data. And Mark had an interest in, just all kinds of ways, finding new ways of exploring data, exposing data, revealing, latent meaning or hidden patterns within numerical data. And so we started to, in the course of our research, long before Listening Post itself was conceived, we started to think about what would be interesting data to listen to. And Mark hit on the idea, well, why don't we listen to internet chat? Why don't we collect enough of it so that we can treat the language itself like data, right? Words and language, you can generate data from, you can count the words, you can perform linguistic analysis and all kinds of statistical explorations and evaluations once you have enough text collected. So why don't we collect masses of text from internet chat and analyze it and then use that as our data set. And that was sort of the origin of Listening Post as on screens and 231 little clickers that we can use, and the speakers and the sound system and the voice. So it's a pretty complex instrument, but that's how we kind of regard it. And so we tried to develop compositions that would exploit it, to the most advantage.
Extracts of conversations you got, or how many time you took to, let's say, one month of online chat?
I'm having a hard time hearing the question. How many
pieces of conversation you have in the database?
I don't know the answer to that. Mark is
even
much better.
Roughly like 100,000, 10,000, 1 million.
We've collected by now, in the archives, millions and millions of messages. Well up into the millions. I think how many we collect every day varies to some degree, and Mark has kind of tuned it gradually, because the piece, if you think about it, it sort of consumes, it requires a certain level of messages. It requires, some number of thousands of messages per day in order to function and to, continue to be representative and varied and to be the piece that it is. But at a certain point, we were collecting far more messages than were actually required. So Mark has kind of tuned the data collection to be just whatever, 20% more than what we actually need to use, so that we're treading as lightly as we can as we collect messages from all the various chat rooms.
And what kind of chat rooms do you use? Can you name the sites? Can you name the sites? Basically,
we have a database that Mark is always kind of refining as chat rooms, become inactive and new ones come online. We try to keep it up to date, but it's a database essentially of as many chat rooms as we could find. For basically, one of the main criteria is we only pull data from active chat rooms with lots of people in them. If there's a chat room that is empty or only has 2 people or 4 people chatting in it, we think of that as almost like a private conversation, and we don't want to be monitoring that. So only chat rooms that have a big active conversation, then we pull little text and then move on and pull from somewhere else. So on any given day, we have no idea where the chat is actually coming from, but by creating the database, we've tried to make it as broadly representative of as many chatrooms as we possibly could, without really regard to whether it's a neighborhood chat or a politics chat or a sex chat or a pets chat or sports or whatever, Our software works in English, so we try to make sure that we're in a chat room that's not in Korean, because otherwise we just won't get very much.
Plans to extend the development of what you're doing right now to personalize it, as you would have heard about the websites like Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, everything has a status message in it. So is there any way that you can change the data source to get it from here, and you can make it personalized for people that can log in and they can hear all their friends speaking through their status through your instrument?
It's interesting that, let me sort of respond in two different ways. One is, we never wanted to make it interactive. We never wanted to make it personalized in that way, because we wanted to make it, it's philosophically what it's trying to do is listen to everything. Listen to the big buzz. What is, if people are talking today about Myanmar and the storm there and the disaster there, we want that to be reflected. If they're talking about the earthquake in China, we want that to be reflected. So we didn't want it to be tunable, even by us. We wanted it to tell us what people are talking about. And so if it's interactive and you could actually sort of tune things in, that would sort of undercut that function for us. You mentioned Twitter and Facebook and by extension, I guess, blogs and all this stuff. And it's worth pointing out that when we started this piece in 1999, and even when it first premiered in 2001 and 2002, none of those, there were no social networking sites, there were no blogs, there was no Twitter, there was no Flickr, there was no Facebook, none of those things existed. So all that says, if we were to make the piece again today, it would be a very different piece.
I was just wondering, since you started the project, have you noticed a change in the way people use language to communicate over the internet? Because obviously, when you converse face to face with someone, you use a very different vocabulary and so on. Has there been a change over the past few years that you've noticed just how people communicate with each other over the internet?
Well, it's interesting. When we started the piece, so again, back in 2001, the people who were heavily into online chat was a kind of subculture. And so already there was emerging back then language I had never heard before we made this piece, like LOL and all these kind of, in fact, emoticons were huge back in 2001. Little smiley face punctuation things, and we had to work very hard Mark wrote a ton of software to filter out the emoticons because they were just gumming up the works for us. So that stuff existed in this online chat kind of subculture, and then with instant messaging in the last few years, that's all become much more mainstream, and of course instant messaging with its own vocabulary of even more extreme abbreviation and thumb typing and whatever, and that feeds back into the chat. But I wouldn't say I've noticed much different about how people communicate face to face, but the language in the chat certainly evolves year by year.